Getting your exposure correct is important. In this video, I will give you 5 tips to make that happen easier for you. Hi there, I'm Peter Forsgaard, a professional photographer from Helsinki, Finland. And before we start talking about those 5 tips, please consider subscribing to my channel and hit that bell so you get notified when there is a new video online. My channel is all about you getting to be a better photographer and of course about Olympus gear, and this time I will give you 5 tips about exposure. And tip number 1 is to understand the basics. Understanding how shutter speed, aperture and ISO are connected to each other to get that perfect exposure is important. Here we have 3 different images that have exactly the same exposure but have been photographed with different settings. On the first image, there is a very fast shutter speed which will freeze the motion. And in the second image, stop down to get more depth of field. That's why I had to use longer shutter speeds. And on the third image, I wanted to freeze the motion and have a lot of depth of field, then I had to raise up the ISO. Learn these basics through this exposure pie, which I think represents quite well how these 3 things are connected. But this is the basics and the most important thing for you to learn. If this combination of these 3 things is not something that you know by heart, anytime, any place, anywhere, you should practice. Tip number 2, get to know all the different exposure modes. Most cameras have 4 different exposure modes. You have the program mode, you got aperture priority, you got the shutter priority, and then you have the manual mode. It is said that mastering the manual mode is the holy grail of photography, and once you master manual mode, you're a real photographer, but that's kind of a myth. It's not really that way. I think understanding the tip number 1 and all what that means is the most important thing. But let's get back into the metering modes. Program mode is a mode where the camera chooses the shutter speed and the aperture. And sometimes if you have auto ISO, it will take care of everything. Aperture priority is where you choose the depth of field. With shutter priority, you will use the way motion is recorded in your image. And then with manual mode, you have more freedom of choosing the combination. But all these ways of making the exposure is a right way. Just learn which exposure mode is the one that you need to use in different situations. Let's say that you need to have a certain amount of depth of field in your image. Then just choose aperture priority and set the aperture to the value that you want. And then camera takes care of the rest. And if you want to freeze the motion and you need a fast shutter speed, then shutter priority is the way to go. And the camera takes care of the 2 other things, aperture and ISO. And then if you want to control everything, you set the camera to manual. But remember, when I say control everything, it doesn't mean that you can set anything for those values. It depends on the amount of light you have. It's a light meter that will tell you how much light there is in the scene, and that will be the restriction on your different combinations. What is your favorite exposure mode? Please let me know in the comments down below. And let's next talk about tip number 3, which is understanding how the light meter works. The light meter works so that it thinks that everything is mid-gray. If you are photographing a really bright scene, it will make it more grayish than it actually is. And the same applies with darker scenes. It will lighten up darker scenes. And that is the one important thing to understand. And then there are different methods of metering the light. You have the evaluating that it evaluates the whole scene, and then you have a center weight, and then you might want to use a spot meter. I very seldom use spot metering, but what about you? Do you use spot metering at all? Please let me know in the comments down below. But the number 4 is next, and that is learn to read the histogram. Histogram is your tool to check out the exposure. If there is gap on the right side, the image might be a bit underexposed. And if there is too much gap on the darker side, the image might be too bright. But that also depends on your style. But understand that if this histogram goes all the way over the lines on the right or the left, then there is some problems in the exposure. If it goes over on the right side, then you will clip your highlights and everything is lost. You cannot recover any details that are clipped. And if you're going too far to the left and underexpose too much the image, you will crush your blacks and everything that is black won't have any detail. And before we go to the fifth tip, there will be 2 extra tips. Like there always is at least 1 extra tip, but this time 2 extra tips. And the tip number 5 is one of the most important things. Learn to use exposure compensation. Like I said earlier in this video, that light meters in cameras think that everything is mid-gray, and that will make bright scenes too dark and dark scenes too bright. So you need to have exposure compensation. What it actually means is that you will compensate the meter values with your camera. The best way to use exposure compensation is to set it to a wheel on your camera, a dial on your camera where you can really easily access it. Some cameras have a dedicated button for that, or not button, but a dial for that. But you can also, in most cameras, customize it to be on the back wheel, which I prefer. Of course, it can be on the front wheel too, but if you have exposure compensation customized to your back wheel on your camera, it's easier to access without lifting the finger from the shutter button at all. So you will make the image faster. If something happens and your compensation is not fully done yet, you can still take the image with your finger on the shutter button. So that's why I prefer the back wheel. And I use it all the time because I use a method called ETTR where I will expose to the right. So I will make a as bright image as possible without clipping the highlights to make the image sensor to capture most data it can do. And what about you? Do you like to use ETTR? Please let me know in the comments down below. Especially if you don't, that would be interesting to hear why not and what are your reasons why not using that. And I do have a video about ETTR over there. You can watch it if you haven't seen it yet. It's one of my most popular videos of all time. There's some good information about ETTR and why. And it works on every situation. I know there have been some videos that say that it doesn't work when in low light, but it does. But remember, if you use ETTR, you need to do some post-production, and it works best with raw images. If you're shooting JPEG, then I wouldn't use ETTR that much. But watch that video that I showed. I will have it in the end screen also, so you can go there after you watch this video. And now the extra tips. Learn how to use flag colors or blinkies, as they are also called, or learn how to use zebras in your camera. As I said, I usually expose to the right as much as possible, and I use flag colors in my Olympus cameras because then I can set the value so that just before my highlights are clipped, there will be a red flag color, and then I can go. All right, now the neighbors are. I don't know if you heard that, but there was somebody drilling the wall. But that's what it is when you do it. When you're doing in your home studio, there's always some noises in the city. But let's hope that it's only one. Yeah, it's gone. Let's continue. Where was I? Yes, about the flag colors. The way to use it is to set so that the red flag color appears when the highlights are about to clip. And when you have that limit and you see a red on your viewfinder, you still have about half a stop to a stop of information because the image that is shown in your viewfinder is a JPEG. And the final image is most likely, I hope so, it's RAW. What I mean that I hope you use RAW, then you will have some more information to work with. So seeing some red on the brightest spots on the image doesn't really matter. And then the blue colors are indicating that you're crushing your blacks. That might not be a problem, but if you don't want to do that, then you need to do something about it. And then the extra tip number 2. Set your camera so that it will overexpose one stop. This will reduce the amount of exposure compensation that you need to do. And in Olympus cameras, it's done like this. And I'm sure that there is a way in other brand cameras too to do this. And I tend to use +1. It depends on the situation, but usually +1, so I don't need to do that much exposure compensation when I make my images. I hope these tips were helpful, and here are some more videos about exposure. Those might be helpful if that's something that you are struggling with sometimes, like we all do sometimes, so you might want to watch those. But hey, thanks for watching, and bye for now.